Welcome. I'm Lisa Erickson, and I am pleased and honored to be interviewing my department chair, Dr. Erick Hakanson, at his home in St. Paul, Minnesota, on February 25th, 2017. Today we're going to get his history for the record for the American College of OBGYN. Dr. Hakanson, what we'd like to do is talk about your story from beginning to entering into medicine and then your career in medicine.
Okay.
So
I don't know how far back you want to go with my mother and father, but they were both born in Sweden. And my dad came over at 1900. I was pretty sure of that. I'm not quite sure when my mother came because there were too many Amanda Swensons. But my father went out to South Dakota and ran, I don't know how he learned to do this, but he ran the dynamo for the sawmill there. And my mother came probably about that same time independently. They knew each other in Sweden. Unfortunately, got put into a closed estate up New York, and they treated her miserably. And she insisted on leaving because it was otherwise they had no way of getting out. But they put her in the laundry bag, and put her in the laundry bag when they came to exchange old and new laundry. She came to New York, and she eventually ended up in an English professor of English and English literature at Columbia, and we have verification of that and a picture of it, everything. So, but you know, immigrants were mistreated, but she unfortunately ran in this family. Now remember, he was a professor, and they were a nice family, and they loved her, and she loved them, I think, the younger member of the family. But anyway, they had tuberculosis, and she was bedridden. And somehow my father inveigled her to come out to Rapid City, 1905, and get married. She went alone and did that. And they were very, very sad when she left because they didn't want her to go. But anyway, then they got married and they had 2 children. And my oldest 2 brothers. And for some reason, they had a good life there. They loved it there. But he wasn't feeling well. I got not good evidence, but some evidence that he had stomach problems, which I had and what my brother had. So it's possible. But anyway, they went to Sweden late early 1300s, bought a farm, and all during the World War I. They made a fortune. They sold everything they had that could raise or anything. So it was Sweden was neutral, and but anyway. In 1923, they decided to come back to America. So they had 4 more kids. One died, sons I should say. One died in the flu epidemic. So I was two and a half when they came here. And I can date that time exactly because I remember an incident, what happened, that scared me. And I won't go into the details, it's not important, but I can see that picture today. Anyway, so my dad did not give up his citizenship. So I was born in Sweden and 2 of my brothers as American citizens. They ended up in some friends in St. Paul, and eventually in South St. Paul of all places. And it was depression, and they didn't know what they were going to do. My dad finally had to take a job as janitor of a school, which is very fortunate because he had a steady salary. It wasn't very much, all during the Depression.
Sure.
And my mother has boarders, and I don't know how we all lived in a little house, but we didn't, there was no luxury living, but we always had food on the table, and we did, you know, reasonably well. There are a lot of people who didn't.
Where was your house?
That was in South St. Paul, 305 10th Avenue South. But so we were better off than a lot of people in the country because they had the slaughterhouses there. And it was a great influence on me because after I got to be 17, 16 even, 17, I worked in the slaughterhouses in the summertime, which was very difficult, dangerous, horrible work. But I was strong enough to do it, and I made a lot more money than my classmates who were working for 25 cents an hour. I was working for 50 cents an hour or more sometimes. So that's how I paid for my education. And it taught me a lot about working in places like that and who people you could trust and who people you couldn't. And so I was very fortunate. I could live at home and hitchhike, take the streetcar or whatever to the university. And I took a week's testing at the university. It was great in testing at that time. What should I do? I didn't know what to do. But at the end of the guy said, well, he said, you can do anything I want. I said, but that isn't what I came here for. I want to know what. Well, I said, you're doing so well in chemistry and sciences and physics and math. He says, have you ever thought of medicine? I said, well, my best friend's father was a doctor, and that's about the only relationship. So he said, well, why don't you give it a try? So I did, and I liked the guys that I met in my class. And so then I started reading more about it and thinking about it and talking to other people. So then I got quite enthusiastic about that. But anyway.
Where was college?
At
the University of Minnesota?
Yeah, at the University of Minnesota. Well, anyway, I made a pact with a good friend that we were going to Air Force. If I didn't get in medical school, we'd go to the Air Force together. He eventually got killed in the first daylight raid over Germany. So that would have been my fate too, I think. But anyway, I got into medical school. And then, of course, 7/11, I mean December 7th, the 11th of they bombed Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know what was going to happen to us. So I chose, well, then it became we could choose one. I chose the Navy. And we were in heaven after, because we were borrowing money from the university at 2% to pay for the tuition. But when I got in the Navy, I got a uniform, tuition, books, and I think it was, I can't remember, it was $20 or $30 a month, but it was a lot of money. We were in heaven anyway, but then we went year-round. Okay. No vacation, no nothing.
How much was tuition at that time?
Something like $240, mm-hmm. And then we had the quarter system, and they were like something like $60, $70 a quarter. But it's all relative, anyway, so I graduated from medical school when I was 23, because we went the year on, and we only had 3 years of pre-med if your marks were good enough. See, so. And then we all knew we were going into the war, and that made a big impression on a lot of us. Some of us had a very bad attitude about that. But anyway, it was a good experience in medical school. I ushered at Northrop. And then the best thing that happened to me was in the cloakroom, where when none of the rich ladies came, I knew all of them. Families in Minneapolis and St. Paul, I'd help them on with their shoes and their coats. Sometimes they only stayed the first half. And some nights, Jim Austin and I sometimes we'd take home $10. I mean, that was a lot of money. So, and there was not just the orchestra, there was Metropolitan Opera, there was a ballet, there were a lot of things. So we ushered a lot, and we had uniforms. We had tuxedos, of course, had to buy one. And we got into trouble coming to class, histology class one time in our tuxedos. They didn't think it was very funny. But anyway, we had a nice class. But I want to emphasize something. At that time, the University of Minnesota Medical School was considered one of the top 4 or 5 medical schools in the country. We had basic science people. I can name them all of them now. Downey, Handbook of Medicine, 3 big volumes. Vischer, who did early work with Einthoven in the electrocardiogram physiology. The embryologist, I can't remember. Bell in pathology wrote the textbook and so on. In clinical medicine, we had C.J. Watson in medicine, Wangenstein in surgery, Peyton in neurosurgery, A.B. Baker in neurology, Leo Rigner. They sent him to Stockholm to learn some finest radiology at that time. But the point is that these giants, they made rounds with us, you know? They were approachable, and they were fantastic role models. And that's why I ended up in teaching, actually, and a lot of my classmates as well. And it was a fantastic experience. And what went wrong, I don't know, that in about middle 60s, 70s, it was a little scandal here or a little something there, and I don't want to get into names, and a lot of these people were not replaced with people of equal stature. So that was too bad, but it's trying to get its way back, and I think there's some hope for the future. A lot of other things in being that happened to other medical schools too. I thought it was. I recently spent an evening with 2 of the people who are in the they're physicians, the staff members of the clinics, but they also have a say about what's going on, and I offer them a lot of suggestions because I had to take Karen, my wife, to so many doctors, and I went to a few myself. So we had a lot of interconnection with the clinics, and there are a lot of things that need to be improved. Of course, I'm not a defender of our medical care system at all.
What year did you graduate from medical school?
August 1944. But, you know, the system that has developed now is terrible. They don't even discuss single-payer plan, which is every civilized country has, and it's public and paid by our dollars. But I don't want to get into that subject because that's a subject all by itself. But anyway, I learned a lot from my teachers, and I tried to carry out some of the things that they did. I mean, they were dedicated to teaching, research, and community efforts, and so on. And
Right.
I ended up with the USS Ormsby, a troop carrier, AP A49. Anyway.
Was that after medical school? Or?
Yeah, after my shortened internship, because the war was still going on. The war in Europe was done, but there were still a lot of problems in the Pacific. You know what a kamikaze was? Yeah, fighters and so on. So anyway, we were assembling a armada in the Philippines to invade Japan. I was on the USS Ormsby, and I was only in harm's way one time when they thought they heard a submarine, and it turned out to be nothing.
What was your rank at that time?
Lieutenant, junior grade. That's a
And were you
little bit above ensign, but not much.
Were you serving then as a
Yes,
physician?
anyway,
As a physician?
But I was just a physician, yeah, just a recent graduate. We locked ourselves in a hold. We got locked in the after hold with all the troops. There I was with my life jacket, my helmet, and they turned the door and the bulkhead closed, so you couldn't get out. And I thought to myself, 2 years service at that time, and I said, I don't know if I'm going to make it. But I did. Anyway, it was only that time, and we were in the Philippines, and on August 5th, they dropped the atomic bomb. And it took about 3 years, or 3 weeks, or 3 months, 3 weeks about, to finally they were going to sign the peace agreement. And our ship went up there for that peace agreement with many others. And it was pretty clear to us at the time that if we had invaded Japan, it would have been, I don't know, 50 million? Who knows, casualties and so on. So the atomic bomb was a lifesaver for all the troops that were assembled up there. I can't believe they were serious that they were going to invade Japan, but they apparently were. But then the atomic bomb changed everything. So then I got sent back to Hawaii, and that was a very hazardous trip because they didn't keep their airplanes in top shape. Well, I don't know, what was that book that was written by this Italian kid who was a runner? She made a fantastic book out of it. The movie was terrible, but the book, Unvanquished, I forget the name of it. It was about that experience anyway, that they didn't maintain their ships. Their airplane crashed, and they spent, I don't know, 1,200 days, something in the Pacific. But anyway, I just mentioned it because every time I changed positions, we had to fly, and I swore I'd never fly again because I barely escaped with my life several times. But anyway, I won't go into details of that, but anyway, I got to Hawaii, and bingo, I was in the Marine Corps. And then I flew all the way back to Guam. That was a terrible flight, and we lost 2 engines in the wing, in one airplane. It was a four engine plane, equivalent of a B-26, I think, in the Navy. But anyway, we made it to Guam, but just barely. And from Guam, I was in China with the Marine Corps, and there I spent 17 months with the Marine Corps.
And your role as a physician,
Yeah.
what did you need to do?
Yeah, I had to, we had roll call. We had to go out and visit people who were, Marines who were watching the bridges and things like that. It was a total communist control area. And while we were there, we often speculated on it. I think we were there to protect the Kaolin mining, K-O-I-L-I-N mining administration railroad from Mukden, Manchuria, all the way down to, it was an English-American firm, I think. But anyway, we never got bothered by the communists at all. They were mostly farmers out there. They didn't know what communism was actually, but the communists were very, very clever. They didn't rape their women, and they helped them with their food and how to plant it and a lot of things. So they were a very potent force. One at a time, when I go in my Jeep with my corpsman, I'd find a post with a big stack of written material like that, why we should get out of China. They were no danger to us at any time. So then I came home here, and I decided to get a master's degree in physiological chemistry. And I got that in 1948. And then I got a postdoc scholarship from the U.S. Public Health Service, which later became HEW. I forget what it's called now. But anyway, to study at the Karolinska Institute, specifically the Nobel Medical Institute under Dr. Kasperson and Cell Research and Hugo Theorel, who later got a Nobel Prize, by the way. So I was there for 18 months. And then I came back. Well, that's where I met Karen, and way up north in the ski resort.
Your wife?
And then we came back in June of 1950 and managed to get a small apartment on campus, which was no easy matter. And I started my residency, a fellowship in OBGYN.
And how did you know to pick OBGYN?
Well, that was partly Dr. McKelvey's fault. We all had to give a paper as seniors, and I gave one on the fetal placental maternal relationship, and he thought it was a pretty good paper, and he actually called me in his office. He says, I'd like you to consider OBGYN, because I didn't know what I was going to do at that time. And I said, well, thank you very much. I said, I'll consider it. So when I came back, I called him, and his answer was, well, when do you want to start? So I started right away on July 1st, and then I stayed on. Well, he asked me to stay on because they were short one, but I think it was, I don't remember the exact date, but I got a nice little letter from the U.S. Navy saying, please report to U.S. Naval Hospital, Oakland, California.
Well, you were redrafted.
Well, the Navy, the Army let their medical personnel go, their reservists. I was never regular, I was USNR, reserve. But the Navy kept us in, even though they sent me all sorts of communication. I never responded to any of them, but it didn't matter to them. They said, report March 1st. So I did, and there I was in Oakland, regular Naval Hospital. They had 300 deliveries a month and lots of GYN surgery. They had a residency program, and they had totally incompetent faculty. They were Navy people, and the residents were totally on their own practically. And I couldn't believe what was going on there. It just came off my residency, a senior fellowship,
Right.
And so I had an interview with the captain, the four-striper admiral, very nice fellow. And I said, I told him quite frankly, I said, I don't know how long I'm going to be here. Well, they said they have every month they have somebody, they send them over to Korea. So I said, with your permission, there are some things I'd like to change, and I made a list of things and told them what I would do. And I said, but I need your blessing if I can do that, your order that I have the power. Because one of the residents even outranked me. He was a full commander. I was a lieutenant junior grade. Anyway, by the way, I told him, I said, you're not a commander to me. I said, you're a doctor, or I'll call you their first name. I said, I'm not calling you commander ever, so you might as well know that. I got in a little trouble over that later too, but anyway, that was a different matter. But anyway, I started to do something there, And the first month went by, and I wasn't on the list. The second month went by, and I wasn't on the list. And so we went over to San Francisco and always had a big party. We had 2 kids at that time, and later on, Lisa was born. But then this was late in the third month, and then he finally told me, he said, well, he said, I've decided to make you essential for here, so you're not going to be going. I went back and told my wife, I think we had a great party that night. Anyway, so I stayed there, and I revamped the whole program from bottom to top to bottom. And I had a former faculty member that I knew in Stanford, and I had several people come and give talks, and we had conferences, and we reviewed cases, and it took a while, but I finally got their confidence that I knew what the hell I was doing. And there were several cases that were totally mismanaged, and I told them so after the fact, and I proved to be right, so that gained me some stature, you know. So it was an interesting experience, and I learned a lot from that myself. And so then I came back here, and I contacted McKelvey again, and he said, well, he said, a couple of things. He said, I want you to be in charge of the program at the old Anchor Hospital, because the university had made a formal relationship with them. They were part of the graduate school, and medicine, surgery, and pediatrics already had. And so I stepped in there. But I asked, there was a lot of guts. I asked my Dr. McKelvey, I said, you know, I don't have any money. I haven't had any money, and my family is growing, and you didn't have a full-time staff opening. It was only going to pay me half-time. So I said, you know, I'd like to have some opportunity to have private patients so I could make some money. And so I actually did with a Lilleberg and Watson downtown St. Paul. And that was in 1955, something like that. But then I was spending more time at Anchor than I was with my private patients. So I went full-time academic, 1963 or 64. And but then when they built a new hospital, a number of things converged. Dr. McKelvey retired, and the department was in bad shape all of a sudden. There I was left as chief of the department at the new hospital, St. Paul Ramsey, with quite a workload, and so I started to get money. I was able to get a grant of $300,000, and that was one big lump of money. I don't know how much it is in today's term, but it's probably close to $4 million or something like that, to give specialist care to high-risk patients in St. Paul. And I also started a midwife program, and eventually we had, I think it was about 6 midwives, and got a permission to have a accredited program and a residency program and so on, because the department was practically in collapse at that time. And in that whole period, those 3 years. Then they were looking for a new head, which I wanted very badly, because I thought I was the...
Chair of OBGYN at the University of Minnesota?
Pardon me?
Was that chair of OBGYN at the University of Minnesota?
Well, at that time, McKelvey had just announced his retirement, and I think they did a kind of a, well, I like to think of it, I'm biased of course, they had a very quick search committee. I was not even interviewed. My name was discussed and everything. I found out all the details 10, 12 years later from Ellis Benson, my classmate who was in on that committee. I had apparently, my views on women's free choice and abortion and contraception and also I was active at the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And I found from Ellis that a couple on the committee were not about to have me as department head. So that was the end of that, which depressed me for quite a while because that was disappointment. I had an opportunity to go to Columbia with Dr. Taylor as assistant professor, but we had 4 kids at that time, and I didn't want to, for typical Midwesterner bias, I didn't want to raise kids in New York City.
Right.
Anyway, so I stayed here, and so I decided, okay, I'll see what I could do at Ramsey, and I had my own philosophy about what should be a good program. A good doctor takes care of the disease, cancer or whatever, but a great doctor takes care of the patient with the disease.
Right.
And I always remember that, and then of course I remembered all my role models that what I was in school with, and I changed that a little bit later to saying that in order to make good decisions about important, very complicated things with patients that would affect them, that you had to know their past, their present, and their future. And I pretty well stuck to that. And I had a lot of ideas about how to teach medical students, residents, and staff. So I inaugurated a number of conferences that we had to have, which would drive the residents crazy sometimes, but we had what in essence were sort of preoperative conferences where we had case presentations that had to conform to certain things. They could not present a case without having previous surgery, surgical reports, histological reports, or other important information. I just wouldn't allow it. So they learned how to present a case and the full history. And we had a history conference every month with the pediatric department, our perinatologist and their neonatologist. We discussed every morbid case in a nursery and all cesareans. We had a cesarean section rate at that time, probably 10, 11%, and more importantly, a perinatal mortality rate that was very low as well, and which is important. And we had conferences also on routine complications. We reviewed all our surgery to see if there were any bad outcomes. We reviewed them, and to see if the pathology conformed with the preoperative diagnosis. And we had journal club, and so it was a pretty full schedule. My problem was, of course, getting adequate staff, and it's not easy inducing people to come to Minnesota because of our bad reputation of being so cold. But so I focused on people that I could reach and talk to, and that's how I got a hold of Gordy Dittmanson. You know, I had to have someone that not only that I thought would be a good teacher, but also someone who's dedicated to that idea and community service or one thing or another. In other words, we had to have staff persons that were ideologically
service oriented.
Yes, and
thank heavens for Gordy.
And so one by one, we assembled a staff. I didn't know about Duscoli. It was, in retrospect, I shouldn't say name, should I?
That was later down the.
Huh?
That was later.
Okay, I don't know if that was a good choice, but anyway, of course, I worked very hard to get Edwards, you know.
Laura Edwards.
Laura Edwards, anyway, and that was a great thing because I thought it was. I didn't like the idea of male gynecologists examining very, very young female infants. I didn't want them that to be their first contact, so I needed a woman very badly.
For adolescent
and,
girls.
And Laura was fantastic. And then we sent, I'm bulking on a name now, to get trained as a perinatologist.
Kasolka.
Huh?
Michael Kasolka.
Yeah, Michael Kasolka. Why do I forget that? Anyway, I funded that, and Laura was sort of grandmothered in.
Right.
And Ismail Barada studied a lot and so on. He actually never got boarded, but he did. He was pretty good in one sense. Remember, we tried to put together the first fetal monitor ourselves. We had a meeting with those two from South America who had one of the first machines. It was started in Scotland, of course, but they gave us a lot of tips, and of course we were able to purchase them later on. But so we had, we had Harry Bloomquist, who was very good, top notch, and then we started to enable us to get some of these conferences together and see exactly what we wanted to do. What my main emphasis was to get the idea across that, as Virchow said 150 years ago, that medicine is essentially a social enterprise. These are people that we're dealing with, you know, that if you don't get to know them and where they're coming from, etc., as I said before, you can't be a good doctor. And we all wanted to build on the idea of getting all the details of a patient's life. And of course, we had wonderful nurses in the clinic, as you recall. All of them were RNs, and they could get information from patients that sometimes physicians can't.
Dr. Hakanson, can you talk about Laura Edwards' high school program?
Yes.
The high
well,
school.
I got a grant of $300,000 to get professional care for all high-risk patients in St. Paul. And it didn't take us long to figure out that the segment of our population I have fortunately included in my
Proposal or grant?
yeah, by grant to include unmarried girls. So they became high risk. So we saw a lot of them, and then we discovered that teenagers were the girls, women, were the most underserved and unhealthy group of the whole bunch. So then I wrote another grant, and got this from partially from the government, but mostly from Johnson & Johnson. And we opened our first clinic at Humboldt, no, not Humboldt, at one right next across the street from the hospital. I'm blocking it. I'll get that name too. Anyway, and Laura was the key person there, and I had to go around to the PTAs and explain what we were doing, what we were going to do, and I thought I was going to be tarred and feathered out of the town by some of these, but I got wise enough finally to tell them, I said, look, you know, we're not talking so much about your children. We know, you know, we're talking about all children, and we have to recognize what's going on, how life is changing, and how kids younger and younger are having relations, and I devoted them to statistics and so on. And I said, look, they can't pick up a magazine or read a book or see a movie or look at TV in their own living room without sex. Boy meets girl or girl meets boy, and 2 hours later or 2 days later, they're rolling around in bed naked. And I said, that's the reality that we live in. So I said, I don't want to talk about the problems. There are problems, lots of them. And I said, I think these clinics will help to make these young girls' lives more meaningful in every way. We wanted to build up the egos. We wanted to teach them that teenage boys, they didn't have any deep thoughts about anything that was above their waist. And we wanted girls to build up their egos, see the dangers of venereal disease and of pregnancy. And the smartest thing we did is have some of these mothers who were in school go around and see how difficult it was
to be pregnant,
to be a student mother.
So those teams went into the high school with a social worker and a
oh yes, we had a whole
nutritionist.
team. We had health educators and social workers, RNs, and a fantastic group of people. They were so good, enthusiastic, and they wrote a new book on sex education. Sex education was by the home economics thing, or the nurse sometimes, when they didn't know anything about what was happening on the outside world so far as making a course out of it, and they eventually put together a book on it because there was no holds barred discussion in our sex education class, and some of our worst opponents were the school nurses because we took all that away from them, but it was a huge success.
So the girls got prenatal care during study hall while they were still
Yes, we
in
kept
school.
them in school. See, that was a big thing that we hammered in. We were not going to let them lose their education. And so there was no stigma for them coming into the class as it was before. And then we also, in the early days, had enough money for child care within the school. And that was great. So then we put other students who are not pregnant or who are not thinking about kids in charge of the kids when the mother was in class.
Of the daycare in the
Yes.
school.
Yeah, so that was a learning experience.
And the girls had access to birth control after they
Well,
delivered
yes,
and were less likely
and
to
that
have
was
a
what's
second.
yes, that was what's so
pregnancy.
controversial. We got then we got a grant from Johnson & Johnson additional to furnish birth control of any kind. We didn't have to spend money for that, and so that was helpful. And eventually, I think there was something like 1,400 at its peak, when I retired, of high school and junior high school clinics. So, and eventually got incorporated in state things. And actually, I was sent down by Johnson & Johnson to Florida to talk to the legislatures down there, a committee to start the school there, and they were all enthusiastic about it, but the legislature killed it anyway. But in a lot of states as we were, well, and actually, I was invited to talk to a national convention at the Harvard School of Public Health on teenage, our experience with the high school clinics, because we did everything for them.
So they were more likely to graduate.
Yes, absolutely, and I don't know. We can talk about. Well, how many did we help or cure or avoid venereal disease, for example, and physical exams and pelvic exams and all that thing, and it was really a logarithmic change so far as teenagers were concerned, and I like to think that those programs were at least partly the cause for our declining so-called illegitimate pregnancy rate. Now there are other things coming in, but anyway, that was a very successful program, and so far as I know, it's still going on in a lot of schools, and I hope so anyway. Now to get back to our staff and teaching residents and so on, it was an attempt to try to make the journey from a first-year resident up to a third or even sometimes fourth year a specialist. And that wasn't easy because well, to give you one example, I don't know if you remember this, but I gave the delivery room nurses the authority to contradict a junior resident's order if they didn't think it was in order, to go to the senior resident and said, I disagree with that, or we disagree with that, or to call a staff person, but we told them to go up the line of command. And some of the residents, first-year residents, really didn't like that, to think that a nurse who could countermand her orders. But I called one of them and I said, look, some of these nurses have been here 15 years. How many kids have you delivered? How many have you stood with labor with, I said, they have learned a lot. And I was an early doubter about the fetal monitoring because for a number of reasons. One, it took the nurse a little bit away from bedside nursing. Secondly, I kept reading the literature, of course, and then even trials where it came up where I had to say, well, I disagree with that interpretation of the fetal monitor, and it turned out, of course, they submitted tracings to so-called experts, and of course they would differ widely. And I got to be a skeptic about that, and I actually got a letter from one of the obstetricians practicing downtown St. Paul saying, why are you so against fetal monitoring? And well, then I had to write a long letter saying why. And of course, 25 years after it was introduced, they finally had a meeting of experts and saying, what do these tracings actually mean? So you see, we were ahead of the circle at that, what do you call it? Head of the curve at that time, and of course it turns out now that they have very strict and very narrow recommendations of what the fetal monitoring does. Obviously, when they fall out of range, going too slow, you're in trouble. But
right.
We knew that from the very beginning. And of course, there was a great study from England that compared fetal monitoring by nurses and the machines. And it turned out there was really no difference. But of course, in England, the midwives had a bigger job, and that's another thing I did. I started a midwife program within the hospital. And at the time of my retirement, I was going to turn over all of the OBs to the midwives, except in those that had high-risk conditions, and there would be a joint effort and so on. And to let the patient choose. Do you want to have a doctor all the time, or do you want a midwife? Always, in case there's a complication or anything, you will have a doctor. And a lot of them chose to go with midwives. Mm-hmm. So that was a good idea, too. And anyway, we did the best that we could, and I think we turned out some pretty good residents. A lot of them went on to do a lot of good things, you know. It's hard to tell you the culture, the atmosphere in those days about abortion and even birth control. And my name was in what was it called, the Catholic something, the magazine that put out here. I was frequently mentioned in there about my activities. I actually was going to go to the diocese and say, look we'll put one of our clinics in your Catholic schools. What about birth? Well, we won't mention birth control, because I knew that they knew we had clinics elsewhere. They knew if they wanted birth control, they were to get it and get the advice. So I say we wouldn't mention one word about birth control. And I think it would have flown, except I didn't get around to get that interview because then I had retired, and my name was no longer important. But I remember I spoke around to churches and PTA groups, Catholic churches. I was on TV, and I don't know why I became an advocate for women. Sometimes the fact that I had 7 granddaughters and no grandsons has something to do with it, because I wanted them to have an equal chance. But I don't know, it just seemed to me that, it started in politics. We wanted about politics and women, and my viewpoint was, I said, half of our population are women, at least half, and they're voters. So how can we possibly avoid discussing these issues from a political point of view? And then actually from an OBGYN point of view, I felt early on, when I took a residency, they were all men. and they were all men afterwards a lot of time too. Laura Edwards was one of the first women, by the way. And I thought this was wrong. I just felt that of all specialties, OB/GYN had to be the most pro-women of any of them. I mean, medicine as a whole should be, but if you're talking about OB/GYN, how can you possibly ignore women? You know, it was so obvious to me, but anyway, I don't know, I just thought it was the right thing to do. Later on, you know, lesbian and all the other things came, but that was much later. In those days, it was very difficult to be an advocate for abortion or a woman's choice, because there was so much church opposition, not just Catholic, and it seemed like there was I don't know, it's hard to explain. Like a lot of people were sort of thought, yes, well, that was not a good thing to do. There still was this idea that it was somehow the woman was to blame. It was a hard thing to get out of somehow. And I remember we ran into that trouble when we reorganized the emergency room at St. Paul Ramsey. Because I don't blame women for being afraid to come in the emergency room, because they were treated like it was their fault, you know? And Van Tyne was great. We called the nurses, the police, social workers, staff, the doctors, and we said we're going to have a separate thing for rapists. We're going to have a rapist kit. John Van Tyne came up with that because he had read about it, where we were going to take pictures, where we were going to take all infectious disease tests and everything. And it got to be it was a difficult thing to change, but no interns could say, we got another rape case in one, you know. We can't say that. Anyway, so early on, I don't know, of course, I worked with nurses all my life, and they were very good nurses. We had a lot of good nurses at St. Paul Ramsey, and I think it was just a what shall I say, a question of pushing the agenda so that people should speak out. More women began to speak out and so on. So you know, and then of course Roe v. Wade happened. And I think the next week we had a clinic. We didn't know what we were doing, but we did it anyway. I and who else participated in that? I forget who all was.
Gordy Dittmanson.
Yeah, Gordy Dittmanson, of course. Gordy Dittmanson was wonderful. Anyway, and the interesting thing that a lot of the nurses that worked in that clinic were Catholics, or former Catholics, I should say, some of them, and it didn't seem to matter. And I actually was invited to give a talk to the combined Senate and House at the state. One person talked about anti-abortion, and I talked pro-abortion. With the anti-abortion, quiet, respectful acting, when I began to talk and so on, you wouldn't believe how impolite they were, interrupting my speech and booing and everything. Yeah, it's hard to believe, but
you were there with Jane Hodgson?
Well, then that came a little bit later, but the Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Senate, I should say, Majority Leader, he wanted a copy of my notes. Well, I said my notes don't make sense, but I'll try to make one and so on. And he used my arguments later on. And the Citizens Concerned for Life, they couldn't do anything because he would never let anything come out of the Senate. So that was good. But later on, then Jane Hodgson, who was one of the few women practicing at that time. In fact, in St. Paul, there were two sisters, a pediatrician and general practitioner, one other woman who did general practice, and Jane Hodgson. And Jane took a lot of stuff from the doctors in town, I think, unfairly. And she was tough, and she did not restrain her comments at all. But anyway, she chose to defy the law about rubella and not doing abortions. And she did abortion, and they sued her. And I was her defense witness. And McKelvey was the state's witness, I should say. I thought he'd never speak to me again, but no, that wasn't the case. Anyway, before the trial was over, Roe v. Wade came by, and so that ended it. Anyway, later on, no, it made no problem. I actually hired, was McKelvey there when you were there? One day a week?
Yes.
Yeah. I hired him to come and teach a little pathology or histology to the residents one day a week, and I paid him for that. And we had no problems. Actually, I don't know if when I was visiting when he was pretty sick in the hospital, he eventually, I think, died from a coronary. He had a cancer of the lung as well. He was a smoker. But we talked about a lot of things, and he was fairly clear in his head, and we talked of some of the people where they went to bed, head departments, and he says, well, he said, I think you were the most successful one. And I literally, Lisa, I almost fell off the chair because I thought, wait a minute, how could that be? Anyway, I was glad to hear it. Anyway, so yeah, he didn't live to about 3 weeks after. 3-4 weeks. Yeah, I think he had a coronary along with his other problems. Anyway, and unfortunately, I was out of state when they had his funeral, so I couldn't say anything for him or anything. I would have liked to, but anyway, he said that to me, and I wish I had a recording of it because I'm not making it up. But that was a shock to me. But it was just one of those things that happened in your life. It's just like years afterwards, you know, I don't know if you remember, but Nicholas J. Eastman, the editor of Williams Obstetrics, who was the father of OB/GYN at that, OB especially, he came here to spend a year while McKelvey was on sabbatical. And Prem was chief at that time, and they didn't get along at all. And actually, he came down to the old Anchor. Well, this must have been in early 1960s. And he preferred to come there where the St. Paul musicians had come in this old hospital room. It reminded him of the old hospital in Johns Hopkins. And we would present cases there, and he enjoyed that immensely. And when I took him to the airport when he was leaving, he wanted. I learned afterwards that a Prem offered to take him, and I said, I got Hakanson take me. They didn't get along at all. He never went to one APCO, that's the Association of Professors of OB/GYN, or GYN OB. I went to every one, and I knew what was going on, and with residencies and so on. Anyway, I read years later he wrote a letter to Karen, and she showed it to me, and in that letter, he had said, well, he said, I envisage a great future for Erick in OBGYN. I said, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you show me that letter? I still have it upstairs. This was 10 years later, you know. I said, well, I probably was a disappointment to him anyway, but those little things you remember, you know? And I don't know how successful I was, actually. All I know is that a lot of our residents turned out to be pretty good. And some students would come back to me and say, you know, I was kind of taken back by some of the things that you said. And for instance, one quote, he said, I was told these, you know, we had students in the early days who went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Catholic college, and who got to be in the medicine. And, you know, they had never heard discussions of sterilization, birth control, abortion, or any of those things. And so it was quite a shock to them, actually. And some of them were quite upset, and I had to counsel them, actually. I said, you know, I understand your point of view. I said, I'm not trying to preach to you. I'm not trying to change you. I'm just saying this is what life is all. This is what an abortion is. These are the pros. These are the cons, etc. I don't want to disrupt your religious teachings and whatever. And but you know, some of them had to spend time in the intensive care unit in pediatrics. And we had, I won't mention the name, but he was terrible. He wanted us to save any of the pathology so they could give a correct burial. Anyway, it was quite a challenge because he was very powerful in the pediatric department. But actually, one time I set him down with.
You're talking about saving very premature.
Yes, yeah,
the extreme
right, and
premature
that extreme
babies.
cases, and you know, years later, some of these students would. Well, I can remember 2 or 3 of them. They said. They repeated some of the things that I said, and I realized they had changed their minds about a lot of things. One said, "Well, you told us one time." I said, "You show me which is the true and only religion. You show me which one that is, and I will join it." And he quoted that back to me. I said, "Have you found the one and true religion?" He said, "No, I don't know which one it is." So. Yeah, and we were filled with such experiences. I guess, you know, who was the thing? I think St. Thomas says that teaching was the greatest charity. And so in that case, I think people who come back to me and say, yes, we appreciated what you've done here, or we appreciate this, that was my payment, you know? So,
I do know. I understand that completely.
Yes.
Over your distinguished career, you have seen how healthcare for women affects life or death.
Oh,
And
you know,
we're moving into a new era that you
yes,
have to have strong feelings.
And you know, one thing, I don't believe in much, Lisa, but I do believe in change. My favorite saying is, the only constant is change. And change occurs more rapidly than you think. And that's why women's movement green movement, labor, even business, environmentalists, all got to join together and say, this is what we got to do. And you know, it worked. For example, I personally, and as I was still quite active in DFL at that time. I was no longer in the central committee, so to speak. But for example, I thought it was a mistake to put same-sex marriage on the referendum, because I said I don't think it'll pass. These conservatives, farmers, they're going to veto it. What happened? It passed with a good margin. You see, it changes very rapidly, and I saw this as more women got the courage to speak up. And for example, in Planned Parenthood, I was the medical director of that for a long time. As a matter of fact, when new OBGYN came into St. Paul, unless they were Catholic and wouldn't do it, they were all required to spend a half a day at the Planned Parenthood clinic to give birth control, fit diaphragms mostly at that time.
Right.
And Planned Parenthood was outspoken, and Schultz, Dr. Schultz's wife, I'm clamming up at her name, her first name, I'll get it in a minute, but anyway, she was good. And they spoke out. They were not afraid to speak out in public. And little by little, it got to be a subject that could be discussed. Before, you could hardly even discuss it, you know. And so gradually, the pendulum began to swing the other direction. And of course, when Roe v. Wade came, that didn't end it. We're still battling with the Hyde Amendment. God, what a terrible guy he was. Where was he from anyway? Nebraska, I think, or someplace like that. But anyway, that Hyde Amendment is still in force. Did you know that? Anyway, I think that, by the way, take out all my anyways. I think that the same challenges face the women today. It's not won by a long shot. Women still need to fight for autonomy, for agency, and for equality. Those three things are absolutely essential. And you got to keep fighting for it, because as you see with the Trump revolution, how difficult it's going to be. So, thankfully, we have a lot more women. In fact, I think, as the latest figure, I think there's a small majority of women who are OBGYNs now.
Right.
And so that's a good change. And I think another change too is that men are becoming educated in these issues as well. You'll see more and more women are saying, yeah, women, why not? You know, why not a woman president? I mean, not down south, you're not going to find that in a majority, but at least I think that, you know, when I first went to Stockholm in 1949, I was amazed to see a lot of men pushing baby carriages in the parks. Well, it took a little while before it occurred here too, where men got the opportunity, but still, women do not have enough time off for childbearing. In Europe, they get a year, or they can divide it between their father and the mother. We still haven't got to that point. Because, you know, it's still the same. Women who work still have the majority responsibility for raising the kids and taking care of the home. And I think there will someday be equality, but it's going to take time. It's going to take time. So, well, you know yourself how it was. You're an example.
Yes,
you
I
know,
have.
it wasn't easy. I don't know what other questions I can answer, if I'm open to any.
Well, thank you so much. You've done a wonderful, wonderful job. If you
Well,
can think of a summary of
yes.
philosophy,
Yes.
of healthcare for women,
Yeah.
I
Well,
think you really...
yes, I hope I have added something. What I emphasize is that over a period of things, times change. The times change very rapidly, and we mustn't be discouraged. We got to stick with our beliefs, and we got to stick with our idea of democracy. We got free speech, and while I think the Second Amendment is wrongly interpreted, it's still there, and it still can be argued, and someday we might get away from gun culture, who knows? Anyway, I appreciate having the opportunity, actually.
I'm just so delighted. What a lovely career that you've had.
Well, I hope so. I hope my family didn't suffer too much. So, I think it was only fitting that I had 7 granddaughters. You know, all lovely, all nice, all beautiful, and pretty smart group.
And thank you for teaching.
Yes, well, you know, we're all human. I didn't say this to you, I don't think, in so many words, but you know, to some group, some students, especially students, I said, but to residents too, I said, you know, I know more than you do. And they say, oh, well, but I said, the reason is because I've made more mistakes than you have, and I've learned from them. And so that's a pretty basic idea, you know. I think the hardest thing was being a role model. The difficult thing was to try to, like each patient is different, each resident is a little different. And sometimes they took a little counseling to get straight. But all in all, it worked out pretty well. We all should try to do the best that we can, but we're all human and we're all make mistakes.